In this video, I'm going to give you an overview of Hibernate JPA. We'll cover the following topics. First off, we'll answer the question, what is Hibernate? Then we'll go through and look at the benefits of using Hibernate. We'll also find out what is JPA and also look at the benefits of using JPA. And finally, I'll show you some real quick code snippets on how to make use of JPA in your application. All right, first off, what is Hibernate? Hibernate is a framework for persisting or saving Java objects into a database. It's a very popular framework that's used by a lot of enterprise Java projects. Basically, at a very high level, you'll have your Java application. It'll make use of this Hibernate framework, and you can use it for saving and retrieving data from the database. Now, what are the benefits of using Hibernate? Well, Hibernate handles all of the low-level SQL code, so it actually minimizes the amount of JDBC code that you have to develop. Hibernate can handle the object-to-relational mapping, and it makes it really easy to create apps to store and retrieve objects from the database. Well, how does it work? Again, Hibernate provides something called the object-to-relational mapping, or you'll hear the buzzword or keyword called ORM. As a developer, all you need to do is tell Hibernate how your Java class or object maps to the data in the database. In fact, you'll map your Java class to a given database table. In this example, on the far left, we have our Java class, that's a student. It has 4 fields, ID, first name, last name, and email. And notice how the fields first name and last name are spelled using camel case. We have the Hibernate framework in the middle, and on the far right, we have the actual database table. In this example, we have a table called student. It has ID, which is the primary key, and there's the first name and last name. And note it's first underscore name and last underscore name. And then we also have a field for email address. And what we do here is that this Java class will map to this given table, and we set up the one-to-one mapping between the fields and the actual columns in the database. You can set up this mapping via a configuration file using XML or using Java annotations. In this course, we'll make use of Java annotations, and I'll cover those technical details in some of the upcoming videos. Now, what is JPA? JPA is the Jakarta Persistence API, previously known as the Java Persistence API. It's the standard API for object-to-relational mapping, or ORM. It's only a specification, defines a set of interfaces, and it requires an implementation to be usable. Now, let's take a look at some JPA vendor implementations. So we start with the JPA spec. It's just a list of interfaces, and we need an implementation. One implementation here is Hibernate. Just like with Java coding, they take those interfaces and they provide an implementation of those given interfaces. And then there's another implementation here, Eclipse Link. Again, they have their own implementation of the JPA specification. Now, there are other JPA vendors out there. You can go to the site here at lovetocode.com/JPA vendors, and I'll give you a list of those JPA vendors that are out there. But I'll go ahead and tell you that Hibernate is probably the most popular implementation of the JPA specification, and it's also the default implementation used in Spring Boot. Now, what are the benefits of using JPA? By having a standard API, you're not locked into the vendor's implementation. So you can maintain portable, flexible code by simply coding to the JPA spec or the interfaces. So theoretically, you can switch vendor implementations. For example, if vendor ABC stops supporting their product, then you could switch to vendor XYZ without any vendor lock-in, which is a good thing. And the reason for this is because you're coding to the actual JPA specification or the standard API. Let's take a look at a scenario here of swapping vendor implementations. We have our application, My Biz app. That's the code that we're creating. And we're writing our DAO code based on the JPA spec. In version 1 of our project, we're using Eclipse Link. And then maybe for version 2 of our project, we want to move to a different implementation. Again, I'm totally making this up, but say, for example, Eclipse Link is no longer around, or there are some issues with that given vendor implementation. Well, we can easily swap in another JPA vendor implementation, and we can swap in Hibernate. And so it's there up and running, and we pretty much have minimal code changes to make because we're writing code to the standard specification. We simply have to change our configuration to tell it which vendor implementation to use. And that's basically it. So that's the main advantage here of using JPA, of coding to the standard API for object-to-relational mapping. Okay, great. Now let's take a look at a quick example on how to save a Java object with JPA. The first thing we do is create the Java object, and this is just really standard basic Java here, right? We simply use the new keyword and we say new student, Paul Doe, and we give Paul a given email address. And that's the first name, last name, and email address. Then we save this object to the database, and so here we make use of the entity manager, which is a special JPA object or JPA helper object. We say entity manager.persist, and then we pass in our object. And what happens in the background is that JPA will take the Java object based on those mappings that we defined earlier, and JPA will take that information and store it in the appropriate table in the appropriate columns, and JPA will do all the work for you. And really, behind the scenes, Hibernate is an implementation of JPA, so really, Hibernate would do all the work for you. But you kind of understand what I'm saying here at a very high level of talking about JPA. This is all really good and really simple. If you remember in the old days of JDBC, you would have to manually write the SQL code. So you'd have to manually set those values, manually execute the SQL statement, and so forth. But here, JPA, with the help of Hibernate, does all the work for you in the background. And I really like this feature. So as you can see, it's really simple here to save a Java object using JPA. Now that we have something in the database, how do we retrieve it? Well, there's a number of different options on how to retrieve objects, but I'll show you here a very basic example by making use of the primary key. Some of the coding here that you see is for what we had from the previous slide. And now I'm going to use this information to retrieve data from the database using primary key of 1. And in this example, I know that our database was empty and we knew that the first item will have the primary key of 1, so I can use this ID. I'll show you other techniques on how to retrieve objects later. Here I'll make use of this entity manager.find, and I tell it what I want to get, a student.class, and I give the ID or the primary key. Behind the scenes, JPA will say, okay, let me go look at this table called student and let me find the student whose primary key matches this ID. It'll find that student object and return it to us, and that's it. And that's basically how we retrieve a Java object from the database. Okay, so let's look at a scenario where you wanted to say, hey, I want to retrieve all the students, not just one student, but a list of students. So that's fine. We can set up a query and get all of the students. JPA has a language for queries. Here I'll say entity manager.createQuery from student, and it'll basically give us a list of all of those student objects. And then I can actually retrieve those objects here from the query by saying the query.getResultList. So behind the scenes, it'll do the query for us, give us a list of objects, and then return it, and that's it, and we can make use of it. Again, notice we didn't have to do any low-level SQL coding or JDBC coding. We simply added code here for using this entity manager, and we could actually retrieve those objects. And so here we made use of a very basic query, actually makes use of something called the JPA query language. We'll talk more about this in later videos, but at a very high level, it allows you to query, and it'll give you all the students from a given database. And you can also set up special where clauses using like, conditions, and so on. I'll show examples of that later on. All right, so the nice thing here is that I showed you a very high level example here of using Hibernate JPA with some real quick code snippets. In the following videos, we'll get into more technical details, and I'll have separate details. We'll dive into each one of these topics. I'll show you how to set up a connection to the database, how to make use of the JPA entity manager. Then we'll walk through code examples for doing all the major CRUD features. And when I say CRUD, I mean create, read, update, and delete. And we'll cover all of that in the following videos. And then we'll wrap everything up with a small project so you can actually see how all of this comes together. And we'll have a full working example by the end of the video series. So we have a lot of good things coming, so I'm excited. So I'll see ya in the next video.